What's good in the hood, YouTube? This is Crazy Samurai 71 here, bringing you another video. Today I'm bringing you a video on Kamen Rider Build episode 21. This episode was really good. Some really serious stuff happened in it, and it was a really interesting episode. It also moved into some really interesting territory with the battle that's occurring, and we'll get into that during this whole episode. So for starters, the episode is called The Unstoppable Hazard, and let's just say this much right now, it really is pretty unstoppable in a way. Well, what ends up happening is that obviously in the previous episode we ended up seeing Sento finally use the hazard trigger with Rabbit Tank mode, and what happens is that when he uses it, we don't actually get to see it in the previous episode. We now get to see it. He uses this form, and what happens is that he begins to lose himself, like Suichi told him. You know, you lose a sense of yourself, and you begin to go on a rampage where you destroy everything in your path. So what ends up happening is that Sento is in this form, and he starts beating up on people. The Hokuto trio tries to attack him, and then eventually what happens is that even Ryoga tries to stop him because he's just going on a rampage. Like, he has no way of stopping himself. And what happens is that Sento ends up actually beating on Ryoga, where Ryoga actually de-transforms. But then he goes after the Hokuto trio, which the three of them try to attack him, and eventually he comes to one of them where he literally goes up to him and just kills him, which, or basically puts him into a state where he's really weak. So then from there, Grease goes over to him, and he's like, "Don't die on me. I need you so much. Like, you know, this shouldn't happen." And what happens is that eventually this member of the trio, which is the Stag Beetle one, which the actual character is Akawa, he ends up fading from existence, but as he fades, he says, "I will always be here," and he gives him his dog tag, and that's the end of him. It was a really dark moment, and you have to remember something. Sento is not the kind of guy that likes to kill people. In the 21 episodes we've seen so far, he's not a guy that likes death. He doesn't like to murder people. Every single time he wins a battle, it's usually the case where where the person turns back into a human. You know, think about it from previous episodes. He's not a person that likes death, and he usually gets really upset when it comes to this stuff. So, of course, that leads to some pretty dark moments where, you know, Sento de-transforms finally, and a week or so goes by, and Sento seems to have withdrawn from the war. So, in other words, they haven't used the war. The government has been avoiding it, and the government still has the bottles or whatever. So, yeah, things are pretty interesting, let's just say that much. So then from there, what ends up happening is that there's news reports and everything, and the war is continuing on. Eventually, there is an attack in one of the districts, which leads to Ryoga going after it, because Sento basically is sitting in his room, laying on the ground in a terrible state, because he doesn't want to be involved in the war anymore. He can't believe he killed someone. His whole goal was not to kill anyone. So, you know, he is left in the worst state possible. So what does end up happening from here is that Ryoga goes after the Hokuto duo in this case, and he also goes after Grease. What ends up happening is that he ends up fighting them a little bit, but at the same time he realizes that he blames himself for everything that had happened. He could have stopped Sento, he feels, but he really couldn't have, because Sento was just too much so on a rampage. So what does end up happening is that, you know, he basically stops in his tracks, and they basically avoid him because they can't stand him, but at the same time they don't want to fight. You know, it's so hard. It's a really hard situation for them. But what does end up happening from here is eventually the Toto government decides to speak to the Hokuto government leader. So what ends up happening is that they discuss doing a representative battle, because basically the Totoo prime minister does not want the war to continue. He wants the war to end. He wants to know that no one else will suffer, no one else will die, and they can just move on. And the Hokuto leader agrees to it in the cases of a representative battle, meaning that the strongest member from each nation will battle, meaning that Build must battle Greece. So that is something to note, of course. And what happens is that the Prime Minister actually comes to the cafe where Sento is and tries to convince him to come and fight against Greece. And what we see is that he is emotionless. He does not want any part in it, and he's just he can't stand the thought of fighting. And so what happens is that it's an uncertain situation. Is he going to fight? Of course. But at the same time, there's always the question, will Ryoga have to fight? So what does end up happening from here is that, he mentions all this stuff about having to fight a representative battle. And eventually, the Totoro Prime Minister does end up leaving. And then what happens is that Sento goes out to the location where Akawa died. And what happens is that we end up seeing Sento laying on the ground, upset, really, really angry at himself for what he had done and, his decisions and everything. And he's just really upset. And he even has flashes of moments remembering the events and even sees Akawa for a split second, which really gets him upset. So again, that's something to note. Eventually, Grease does come over and he does mourn for his friend. And they talk. It was a really interesting moment because what happens is that he has Sento wants Grease to beat up on him. He literally does. He wants him to beat him up because he feels terrible for what he did. And the thing is that Grease doesn't want to. Grease really doesn't want to beat him up because of the fact that this is war. War times are the toughest times, and so in reality it's as much as he would love to beat him up, he understands from a war perspective, this is war, this is what happens. So what does end up happening from here is, but he still says that he still will beat him up eventually in the representative battle. That's the one thing he admits to. He will have no issue fighting him then, but right now he's not going to beat him up. He understands the current situation pretty well. And what does end up happening from here is that eventually Sento ends up traveling down one of the streets. As he travels down one of the streets, he is eventually met by Suichi. And Suichi is standing on one of the streets. He's just kind of hanging there, and he ends up talking to Sento about the representative battles happening, and he's willing to train him. That's one of the things that ends up happening in this episode. He actually is willing to train Sento. So what ends up occurring is that he basically explains that if Sento doesn't fight, Ryoga will likely do it, because I'm sure he's blaming himself, which he is, as we see. And what will happen is that Ryoga is strong, but he's not strong enough to really beat up Grease to the extent where he will defeat him. So the thing is that Sento has to learn to toughen up and be willing to fight, but at the same time he's worried about if he uses the hazard mode, he'll kill himself or he'll kill someone, and he doesn't want to do that. That's his big fear. He doesn't want to kill anyone. So what does end up happening is that Suichi says that he's willing to let him borrow the bottles that Suichi has and train with him, and also get him into a state where he can use the hazard mode and not lose himself. In other words, where he can just use it with ease and have no issues with it. So that's important, of course, because the hazard mode is a really, really powerful tool, as we saw already. I mean, he was able to kill someone with it. Someone that was a really strong hazard level, he was able to murder them. And the limitations of the hazard trigger are they're non-existent. There isn't really a hazard level where they can reach to, in his case. So, in other words, he's really powerful. So what does end up happening is that Suichi begins to train with him. Sento ends up grabbing 2 bottles from his briefcase that has a whole bunch of bottles in it. The 2 bottles that he grabs are the Phoenix cleaner bottles, which we've seen this trial combination before. So he ends up using that against Soichi, which is cool. And then he switches the Phoenix bottle for a Rose bottle, which is a new one that we haven't seen before. And then he begins to use that, which doesn't really help at all because there's really no effect with that. So then he switches the cleaner bottle for a helicopter bottle, which is something we did see because technically Grease did use the helicopter bottle in the past, but we didn't get to see it with Build. So this is the first time we actually get to see that. And Rose Copter is a best match. So that's cool to see. It's an interesting best match as well because it's like the vines kind of tangle, like, you know, go around the helicopter blade, and it's an interesting effect that comes with it. So it's kind of cool. We see that, and, you know, Sento ends up fighting using it. Eventually, at the very end of this, what we end up seeing is that he also uses Turtle Watch, which is one that we don't actually get to see him like use in combat. What we do see is that he puts it into his driver at his best match. So yes, Turtle Watch is the best match that I'm sure we'll see eventually. It's a question of when. That's another thing. I don't know, but it is interesting to see that. That will be another combination. And of course, there'll be many more combinations coming in the near future. There's already like at least 5 or 6 new best matches planned in the next couple episodes at least. So keep that in mind. But it's cool to see that we got another best match today. So then from there, we end up seeing a fast forwarding after a couple of weeks, because like they literally give it a couple of weeks time, where he jumps forward to the representative battle, where we end up seeing Sento and Grease pitted against each other, and there's a ref that basically is one that calls when they have to start the battle, and they're basically on top of like this real big high rise, it looks like, which is crazy. So in other words, they could fall to their deaths. Like that's how dire the situation is. Like if they fall, they fall pretty much, it looks like, because it looks like they're from a high rise. So keep that in mind. That next episode should be very interesting because, yeah, the representative battle could be happening. Now, does that mean that Grease will indefinitely die? I don't know. That's the thing that's really hard to say. It will be really interesting to see what will happen. We don't know yet. It's still kind of early to say for sure whether or not Grease will die or what will end up occurring. Of course, the reason why I say Grease is because of the fact that it would be Sando because he's the face of the season. So keep that in mind. The other thing to note that I forgot to mention towards the beginning was that they updated the opening. So like it included a couple new best matches. Like it included Rabbit Tank Sparkling, and I think 1 or 2 other new best matches that have been in the show for quite some time, but they just haven't added them to the opening. So it was nice. I don't think they included Grease at all in the opening though, so that's something to note, which is fine. Eventually they might. We'll have to wait and see. It depends on, obviously, if Grease lives. That's another thing to consider. But we'll have to wait and see how things work out. Definitely overall this episode was really good. Really dark stuff. Again, I know I'm speaking a little bit more somber in my own words. That's only because this episode was a darker episode and I kind of feel like it fits it a little bit. But yeah, it's interesting. This episode is darker. I mean, the show in general is not a light and cheery show. It's a dark show. So again, this is not like unusual. And Kamen Rider is typically a somewhat darker show, but like this season is like particularly on the darker end. So keep that in mind. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. I'd love to know your guys' opinions. Did you guys enjoy this episode? I personally did enjoy this episode. It was really dark, but it was actually a really good episode. And dark episodes can be really good sometimes, and this one was definitely dark and definitely good. So I'd love to know your guys' opinions. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. Tell me what you guys think. I'll see you guys in the next video. So until then, guys, I'm Crazy Samurai 71, and goodbye, guys.